Okay, well, thank you very much, Lennox. My pleasure to be on this program. We would have loved to be in New York and doing our roadshow. It's not to be this year, apparently, but we have what to look forward to in the future. Um, I will be speaking about the export opportunities to Israel with a bit of background about Israel, and I hope will enlighten you a little bit if you have not had this experience. So I just want to acknowledge that some of the information that I've gathered, I've taken from the US Commercial Services Office in Tel Aviv. The reason that I do that is because I like to have consistency in the numbers that we broadcast abroad. And instead of everybody presenting different numbers, I like to get the statistics that they use as a basis for our information. If you know Israel, my colleagues have spoken about Canada and the United States and China over the past couple of weeks, where they refer to the size of their countries as being around 33.5 million square miles. And here I am coming along and talking to you about a country the size of 8,000 square miles. And it's compared to New York with 55 and New Jersey, which is about the same as Israel. We have a population of 9 million, and that would probably generate the question to you as to why are we even considering Israel as a market when it's so small in size and has a relatively small population. I think we'll manage to explain some of this to you during the course of this presentation, and you'll understand that in actual fact, New York is a very, Israel is a very important market to New York and to the United States in general. The population growth is around almost 2%. There's a religious affiliation where the population is divided between 75% of the population are Jewish, 17.5% are Muslim, 2% Christian, and 1.6% are Druze. You remember, Lennox, on your last tour of Israel, I took you to visit a Druze village, and we had the pleasure of meeting and understanding a little bit more about that. The official languages are Hebrew and Arabic, although I think most people understand when they come to Israel and engage with Israelis that most Israelis speak a very good English, at least to the extent that they can make themselves understood. The Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is a parliamentary democracy. This is the basis on which the government runs. If you've been following Israeli news for the past 18 months, we enjoy elections so much in Israel that we had 3 elections over 14 months in this country, beating many others in the world. Obviously, we're in very trying times in Israel. We are part of the global community when it comes to COVID-19. We also discovered our first cases back in February. We immediately introduced social distancing and then a full lockdown. On the 4th of May, there was already a gradual easing with many variations, all trial and error. But the fact of the matter is that as early as July 1st, it was already generally recognized that we are deeply into a second wave, and it was spreading very quickly. To date, there have been 108,000 infected in Israel. At the moment, there are about 20,000 active, and 875 have died. I was looking up the US numbers just yesterday. I saw that in the US there were 43,000 yesterday that were infected. In Mexico, 5,200 were infected in one day. And the fact of the matter is that while Israel is frantic, and as you saw, we're a very small country, so that everybody's on top of everybody here, even to the extent that you try to keep a social distance, our numbers are not really reflecting the seriousness of the situation, where tragically that everyone is an important soul, and 875 have gone. but this number doesn't compare in any way with some of the trading partners that we deal with around the world. The supply chains have remained intact completely in Israel, but travel has been very much impeded to the point that El Al, for example, Israeli airline, has been grounded almost completely and announced that they would be grounded until September 30th. They also got into very serious financial distress, but that's beyond. The fact is that we do have flights coming into Israel. United is still flying in a daily flight. Delta is now flying into Israel. But on the whole, it's Israelis that are returning to Israel because anyone else that wishes to visit is going to generally encounter, unless you have a special reason, a refusal for entry. Those that do return have to go into a 2-week quarantine. And as a result, travel is almost down to very, very small numbers. If you want to get onto a flight, there's no problem getting onto a flight at this stage. The economy has been a very fast-growing economy over the past few years. In fact, back in '85, when I was an official in the Israeli Ministry of Finance, and we had 480% inflation rate, we are now down to a 1.1% inflation rate, which obviously is not really inflation. In fact, we have policies that are trying to get the rate up to 2 and 2.5%, because that indicates a demand for consumer consumption, for private consumption. The GDP of Israel is $360 billion. That compares to New York's, which is, I believe, was 1.7 trillion. And GDP per capita in Israel is 40,500. All in all, these numbers are the result of extremely fast growth, and mainly driven by public and private consumption, and obviously the technology industry. The unemployment rate in 2019, before 2020, before the onset, was just 3.5%. It shot up to 10%. As a macroeconomist in my own profession, I actually don't consider these numbers to be too relevant. It's going to be a question of time before we get things back in order. People will be back in the employment. It's not really in the hands of any government or any specific body that can make it happen before we take care of the COVID-19 solutions. You asked, why should we export to Israel? As I mentioned, there's been 3.5% average growth for several years, and it is expected to drop to 6 to 8% in 2020. Again, I don't think we need to place too much importance on that, as I don't think the American market should be placing too much importance on these numbers. These are exogenous numbers that are not the result of economic policy or economic activity, but others may think differently. And our GDP per capita is 40,000. If you look at comparative numbers, it's about the same as the UK, and it's actually more than Italy and Spain. And it's double the per capita GDP of the region of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. These are our combined, our immediate neighbors. And Israel's GDP per capita is double of their combined GDP. And it's actually more than the combined product of the 4 neighbors as well, where, as you saw, we have 9 million population, and they have a combined population of about 200 million. So these numbers make Israel extremely out of the window, if you like, in terms of regional situations. But it also explains why Israel is an important market for exporting to. As I mentioned before, the growth is driven by private and public consumption, huge investments in infrastructure, and the government has been trying to drive a major real estate program in this country for several years now without very much success in trying to provide greater supply of housing, to lower the prices of housing, and provide for young couples to be able to purchase a home, which is the norm and the way that things are done here. But this has not really succeeded. The demand is still outpacing the supply, and prices are continuously going up. Israelis are open to new products and they love made in the USA. They consider USA to be product quality assured, high quality, using good materials, good inputs for their products. And Israelis are even willing to pay a slight premium for buying made in the United States. Uh, Obviously, not at all costs, not all things uh, will be bought. Amazon is extremely popular in Israel, I can tell you that. In fact, when they agreed to ship for free to Israel towards the end of 2019, the infrastructure of distributing those parcels almost broke down completely. At the end of the day, we did get the parcels, but very, very popular. You should also know that there are about 250,000 US expats living in Israel, and there are many Israelis who are alumni of American universities. I would say mainly New York universities. If you go into LinkedIn and you study the resumes of the people that appear on LinkedIn, it's unbelievable how many Israelis have actually done some of their studying in the United States. And they've enjoyed the benefit of coming back to Israel and being able to present themselves with having received a first-class worldwide additional education. There's a very modern banking logistics infrastructure in Israel. It has one of the highest penetrations of mobile telecom. In fact, I don't think there's an Israeli that doesn't have at least 2 phones. I don't know why, but that's just the way it is. And then we'll talk about this some more in a little while, but it's a very strong, diversified, technologically advanced, high-tech sector in the country. Sort of a breakout from the military in this country, where people are working on very, very high tech systems in the army and are using those skills that they're developing as young kids and going into university and then starting their startups and making it a startup nation. So just a few of the trade statistics. The US-Israel Free Trade Agreement that was signed back in 1985 was actually the first of its kind between the United States and any of its trading partners, has led to an 8-fold increase in bilateral trade between the two countries, and it continues to grow. Israel is the US's second largest trading partner in the Middle East and is the 24th largest trading partner in the world. That is with a population, I repeat, of 9 million and 8,000 square miles of territory. The total trade amounts to about 50 billion. 20 billion is exports to Israel, 30 billion imports from Israel. This is one of the sore points of commercial trade, of commercial relations, not sore, but certainly one of the big efforts that that the commercial services people over here in Israel are trying to do is to close that gap to the extent possible. They've done a very good job over the past 20 years. We now have tons of American cars in Israel. One of the things we try to explain to the US Embassy and to the commercial services is that when an Israeli goes into a shop to buy a Dell computer and they think they're buying made in USA, they discover that that computer was manufactured in Holland. And then they go in and they want to buy themselves a General Motors car, and they discover that it was manufactured in Spain. And you cannot really hold the Israelis responsible for a trade gap when the outsourcing of manufacturing has gone so widely, so global from American corporation point of view. I believe there is now a bit of a movement back from that phenomenon, but at the end of the day, there is a gap. New York exported in just goods of 4.2 billion in 2019, and that does make Israel New York's 5th largest trading partner after Canada, Hong Kong, Switzerland, and the UK. The products that are included in that 4.2 billion are very much proportionate to the general breakdown of New York exports around the world, led by gemstones and jewelry, which is usually at the top of the list. That will account to almost 1/3 of the 4.2 billion that we have exporting to Israel. By the way, this number fluctuates between 4 and 6. There can be a major deal that originates out of New York that suddenly pushes the number up, and then it goes back down to a more average kind of thing. Or if you have a situation like 2020, where priorities are going to change in terms of jewelry and gemstones, I expect that at least to a certain extent there will be a drop in some of that. Once again, it's a small country, but we do buy 4 billion of New York exports. Pfizer and IBM, Bristol Myers are all New York-based companies and are all very, very eminent and very prevalent in the Israeli market, where, once again, Israelis like to buy those products. The other thing is that when Northrop Grumman moved its headquarters from New York, they left hundreds, if not thousands, of outsourced suppliers, and many of them located in Long Island, many of them in central New York. These guys are all there, and many of them have been able to establish a very good market over here in Israel, and continue to do so. I'll just go on to continue to explain that the relationship between New York and Israel is very deep. There are very strong cultural, educational, R&D, investment, tourism ties. We know that it's the world's 2 largest Jewish communities. There are a lot of relatives that live in each place, where they will visit. New Yorkers will visit Israel, visiting their children or their parents, and vice versa. The business environments are driven by innovation and technology, educated, very highly educated, very entrepreneurial and innovative society. And discussing goods and export, I think we should mention that services are also very prominent in terms of New York providing services to Israel. This is obviously out of the financial markets in New York, where every Israeli startup wants to end up launching their companies into America. We are challenged to make them choose New York, but at the end of the day, lawyers and accountants and business bankers and investment bankers are all enjoying very, very vibrant business with Israeli companies, which are not included in that $4.2 billion. I have actually not seen a specific services number on a country-by-country basis. It would be nice if we can try to develop that over the next few years. Yeah. I have a few mini success stories, but I'll just mention a couple of companies that have been in touch with us over in Israel over the past 20 years. There was an ergonomic furniture company headquartered in New York that contacted us some maybe 8 years ago. They do some very good furniture for the high-tech industry, people with computers and computer chairs, and for call centers. They provide furniture for call centers, etc. Certainly a lot of furniture for media type of companies. They started exporting to Israel through a partner that we had connected them with, and things became quite vibrant. The guy that they set up their own sales office here in Israel, the guys remained in close contact with me. I put them in touch with the CEOs of major American corporations here in Israel, in fact, to the point that their sales reached $2 or $3 million in a very short period of time. And the biggest breakthrough that they had was that Intel Israel actually introduced them to Intel USA, and they've managed to develop huge sales into America through the Israeli contact originally. Companies that have participated on trade missions to Israel, when they come, we set them up with meetings with potential partners, with potential distributors and agents, and we know of millions of dollars of sales that have resulted from this. I know that on my last roadshow to New York, which was back in October 2018, I met a company in Long Island. We had a very good conversation. The first thing I did was I persuaded him to join the trade mission that was coming up the following in March the following year. and he did. But in the interim, at the meeting, I actually put him in touch with a distributor that he ended up signing up with. When he sat with me, I put him in touch with a guy that I thought would be the best partner for him in Israel, and they ended up signing an agreement where the Israeli now is representing that company. This was one of the 8-9 companies, Lennox, that you brought over together with Catherine last year. I didn't get permission to mention names, but if people are dying of curiosity, I'm sure we can work that out. Technology collaboration, I think that this is something that we should mention, even though it's a little bit outside of the scope of just pure exports from New York to Israel. Israeli technology is always looking to expand to the US. That is like the raison d'etre. You want to be able to produce your products and develop your products, but the Israeli market is not a relevant market for your sales. You want to get into the US, and it's our business to make them choose New York. We are aware of about 600-700 Israeli companies that are already located in New York. Some of them are very small with 2 or 3 people, but many of them are 10 and 12. We even have 50s and 100s, all located in New York. We have a very good list, very solid list. And this comes out of us putting it on the radar screen for Israeli companies via all sorts of programs that we've developed over the years. Since 1998, there have been MOUs signed between Israeli government agencies and New York State. New York State, Governor Patterson back in 2009 signed an agreement. SUNY Polytech signed an individual agreement. At one point, there were 40 Israeli companies that were on campus at SUNY Polytech working on joint development projects. NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development, have signed with the Israeli Innovation Authority. Northwell Medical has signed with the Innovation Authority, as has SUNY Stony Brook. These are all fairly old agreements, but most of them are still active, and we are always on the lookout for Israeli companies that want to get involved in any of these programs. And then I wish to mention that Governor Cuomo's mission to Israel in 2019 launched 4 initiatives. It was in the fields of smart city, healthcare, MTA, and UAV drone collaborations. I think that all of us that were involved in the organization of that, Lauren Merkel, my colleague that's on this program, were all surprised beyond or impressed beyond with the type of interest that it generated for New York. And there's been a lot of subsequent programs following the governor's mission, where we have now got all sorts of agreements signed between all sorts of interesting parties. So I'll give an example of Roswell Medical in Buffalo that signed with the Haifa University and with the Rambam Hospital in Israel, together with the Maccabi healthcare provider. They've signed a joint research agreement. They're actually working on a couple of projects, and so they should. I should also mention that there are Israeli startups in most of the New York State accelerator programs. I'm sure there's some in all of them. I just haven't checked them all. But I know that Luminate in Rochester and Genius in Syracuse have both hosted New York Israeli companies, as have they done up in Buffalo, where you have 43 North has hosted at least 2 or 3 Israeli companies. How these Israeli companies get to hear about all of these programs is quite amazing. But at the end of the day, we encourage them to take part in this program, because at the end of the day, they're going to set up their US operations in New York. This is FDI. This is what we're looking to do as a supplement to all the trade development that we do as well. Just to talk a little bit about the Israeli business culture. Israeli business people are generally very friendly and informal, very direct. I think I've proven to my colleagues that I'm pretty direct as well. You just say what's on your mind, and is what they intend to convey. There are no nuances. When people want to understand what the guy intends, what he said is what he intends, and that's what you should understand. He's not saying yes when he means no, and not no when he means yes. The atmosphere of business is pleasant. As Israelis like to get to know you. I always tell visitors not to be surprised by very personal and business questions like what's your salary. Israelis are dying to know what people are making and how much they make and how they're making it. They want to know who your competitors are. They want to know what your market position is. To the extent that you're willing to share that kind of information, it can only help foster a better relationship. On the other hand, they are very focused. When you meet with them, they know exactly why they've agreed to meet with you. They've studied your products, they've understood what you're offering, and they are waiting to meet, anxiously waiting to meet when the time comes. Israelis are aggressive. They're known to be aggressive but fair negotiators. I'm not quite sure what that means, but at the end of the day, they like to leave a situation where they agree, where both parties feel satisfied with the agreement that has been signed. And it's most important to become friends in general. And since Israel is a very small country and market size and competition are limited, most Israeli importers are going to demand exclusive rights on your products for as long as possible. That is an issue, I know, for American companies, for New York companies. When consulting with me, I usually advise them how to go about dealing with that kind of situation. I would give them a 6-month exclusivity, let them prove themselves, and then extend it if that is what is proven. Israel is proud to be called the startup nation. I like to always say that while 360 billion of product is not a lot of product on a worldwide scale or an American size scale, but 360 has been produced primarily from Israel's high-tech industry, from people's brains, from people's heads, because there are very little natural resources in this country, except for a very recent find of natural gas off the shores of Israel, which have not really translated yet into real revenue for the country. And the top 5 reasons why you should do business in Israel, I've mentioned them. That's the robust economy, the free trade agreement. It makes for very easy selling of your products into Israel. There should be no taxes, no custom duties or anything like that on anything that bears an Israeli, an American, New York value add of about 35%, according to the free trade agreement. I see that all the funding deals that we offer talk about 51% New York content. That is beyond the general requirement of the US-Israel Free Trade Agreement, which obviously is what applies to New Yorkers selling to Israel. And then high-tech and R&D, you can have 6,000 startups in the country. Every one of those startups are either buying test tubes or machinery or medical equipment, or they're buying cables, or they're buying gadgets that they need. America produces a lot of that stuff, and America is selling a lot of that stuff to Israeli companies. So don't believe that just because a startup is a young company that they don't have $30 million in the bank because they've just done a second round of funding, and makes them very, very capable of buying and not always paying attention too much to the price that they're paying for something that investors always get very angry about. I mentioned that Israelis are very receptive to US American products. The Israelis love New York. Some 300,000 Israelis visit New York in any particular year, any normal year, I would say. And they do it because they just want to be there. They want to enjoy America to the extent possible. I mentioned again technology, innovation. The Israeli government has been promoting technology investment ever since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. I believe that the first law for investment in high tech was enacted in 1951, where they support with actual dollars a huge amount of funding for people doing their research and development and creating products. Obviously, there's a huge failure rate amongst our startups, but the win-win from the Israeli government point of view has been way in excess of any of the losses that they've taken due to companies not succeeding. And then it's actually the highest number of startups outside of the Silicon Valley. I mean, it's really quite incredible. And it's the highest amount invested per capita in venture capital in Israel. Those of you that have visited Israel, you've gotten a taste of the atmosphere in the country. But again, from an export point of view, I'm talking to you to bear in mind that all of these companies are buying tons of equipment and are always looking for the best of the kind that they can use in their development. The recognition of Israel as a global hub of innovation is illustrated by tons of multinational technology vendors and top-tier investors. A lot of New York venture capitalists are involved in this country. There are more Israeli companies listed on NASDAQ than India, Japan, Korea combined. Over 100 Israeli companies are on NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange. And the top industries are cybersecurity, digital media, life science, big data, and software. People that are interested in looking into these markets, they'll get a lot more information when they talk. I always like this slide because it shows you all of the American companies that have set up operations in Israel, usually through acquiring an Israeli startup, whether it's an early size startup or a more mature. I remember Kodak bought a company, Algotech, back some 15, 16 years ago. I brought Algotech to New York on a tour and took them to Kodak. I didn't get paid anything for that deal because it was a formal visit. Facebook, you've got Cambridge Associates, which is also very active in Israel. Obviously, all of these other names that are there. This is just a small percentage of some 350 R&D centers in Israel that are owned by American companies today. I mentioned 6,500 startups. Didn't mention there are 60 accelerators, 9 public universities, and the technical transfer offices, collaborating a lot with New York universities. Everybody knows everybody in that business. And as of most recent, there were 158 venture capital funds in Israel. The keys to success: exporting to Israel puts you in competition with European manufacturers, and you should never forget that. They are just 3 or 4 hours away. And for many years, the US commercial services have been battling with the Israeli government regarding standards for product standards. Generally, the European standards were adopted as being the basic standard in Israel. They have made huge progress in moving away from just having a European standard, and hence we have all the American cars and all the other products that are available from the United States, and were not so not so long ago. We have them in Israel today. And of course, Israel has discovered China. Israel, like New York, buys a ton of stuff from China. And the attitudes have not yet changed too much, but as I mentioned earlier, give them a made in the USA with all things being equal, with relatively equal pricing, and they would definitely choose the American product as opposed to, I don't want to say what. But a clear value proposition, if your product is something that they can see doing very good business with, they will definitely be happy to consider it. I mentioned before, you got to spend time building and maintaining relationships and expect an informal business climate that rewards risks and emphasizes end results over process. That's a very important thing that I will explain when people will come over here. It's called tachlis in Hebrew. It means that just get to the point, stop babbling on, just tell us what you want. These are the top sectors in Israel: information, defense, life science. We had a company from upstate New York, that came to visit Israel on a mission. We took them on a tour, and they got a $3 million pilot project from the Israeli Defense Forces on that visit, and very proud of that. And apparently, I was told recently that their sales have been way in excess of $10 million following that original pilot. That's a company out of Syracuse, actually. Water technologies, Israel has 5 desalination plants. What used to be a huge freak out for Israelis, where we used to run out of water, we now have enough water to drink in the country. Agtech, fintech, obviously these are very, especially fintech is very much New York. Tons of Israeli companies are already located there, but they are looking to collaborate and always interested in collaboration. And then infrastructure. I just saw an advertisement, actually a published RFP where the Israeli Haifa port is up for sale. If you know anybody in New York that wants to buy it, please feel free to let me know. The key opportunities for U.S. companies are in all of these entities, and much more. The services that we provide are market research. We're very good at finding sales agents and distributors. We have incredible databases of everybody, and we know a hell of a lot of them personally, to the point that it's unlikely that you're not going to find a good match if the product is what's sought after. We have very good business contacts. And then collaboration and joint ventures, which is something that Israelis who are are not as willing to take risk for expanding to the US. They're always looking for partners that they can work with as an initial stage. And then I have a lot of Israeli companies that want to buy companies in America to expand their business. That is the work of investment bankers and not so much of government. And that's our presentation for today. We can be contacted at the above, and I believe there may be some questions. Happy to answer. Thank you.